The forge smelled like burning metal and sacred oils. When I first understood what prayer was supposed to feel like, I was 11 standard Terran years old, newly inducted into the cult Mechanicus after my parents surrendered me to the tech priests on my birth world of Gryphon IV. The temperature in the introductory sanctum, held steady at 38 degrees Celsius, maintained precisely by ancient climate regulators that hummed with a frequency I would later learn to identify as 17 Hertz. My instructor, Magos Kendron, placed my small, unaugmented hands on the casing of a malfunctioning data processor and told me to speak the litany of ignition. I repeated the words he had taught me, high Gothic syllables I did not yet understand, and felt something respond. The sensation was warmth that began in my palms and traveled up my forearms into my chest. The data processor's status light shifted from red to amber to green as I spoke. Magos Kendron nodded, his mechadendrites coiling with what I interpreted as approval. He told me I had been heard by the machine god, that the Omnissiah had acknowledged my prayer and blessed the device with function. I believed him completely. I was 11. I had been given to the priesthood because I demonstrated aptitude with mechanical systems. I wanted to believe I was special, that I possessed connection to something vast and divine that recognized me as worthy. The warmth in my chest felt like proof. My name then was Davrin Cole. I remember this because I stopped using it 47 years later when I received my first major augmentation and took the designation Magos Epsilon 7, Davrin. Eventually, I became simply Magos Epsilon 7. Eventually, I became a function rather than a person. But during those early years on Gryphon IV, studying in the Forge temples, learning the catechisms and rituals that governed our interaction with technology, I was still Davrin. I was still human enough to feel cold in the mornings before the Forge warmed. I was still human enough to miss my mother, though I was forbidden from speaking of such attachments. The cult Mechanicus taught that flesh was weak and the machine was eternal. They taught that the Omnissiah, the machine god made manifest, dwelt within every functioning technology. They taught that prayer and ritual were necessary to awaken machine spirits, to plead for their cooperation, to maintain the sacred covenant between humanity and the tools that sustained it. I learned the litany of ignition, the canticle of maintenance, the hymn of reactivation, the prayer of calibration. I learned that speaking these words while performing technical procedures was not symbolic but functional. The machine spirits listened. The Omnissiah heard. Technology responded to faith as much as to engineering. I believed this for 372 years. My augmentations began at age 16 with basic optical enhancements, replacing my organic eyes with superior mechanical alternatives that could perceive electromagnetic spectra beyond human limitation. At 19, I received my first mechadendrite, a flexible mechanical appendage that emerged from my spine and terminated in a multi-tool manipulator. At 23, I replaced my lungs with more efficient respiratory augmetics that filtered toxins and allowed me to function in low-oxygen environments. At 27, I underwent cerebral augmentation, installing cognitive processors that expanded my memory capacity and calculation speed. Each procedure was accompanied by extensive ritual. Each augmentation was blessed by senior magi, who anointed the components with sacred oils while chanting prayers to the Omnissiah. Each time I felt the warmth, the sense of presence, the certainty that something divine approved of my transformation from flesh to blessed machine. I advanced through the ranks of the Mechanicus with competence that my instructors documented as exemplary. I mastered the rituals. I demonstrated profound understanding of machine spirit appeasement. I could repair malfunctioning equipment through proper application of prayer and maintenance procedure. By age 30, I had achieved the rank of tech priest. By 50, I was ordained as Magos, granted authority to conduct research, supervise forge operations, and train junior members of the priesthood. By 70, I commanded a research facility on Mars itself, studying ancient technologies recovered from archaeological expeditions across the galaxy. The warmth was always present during my prayers. When I chanted the litany of ignition over dormant machinery, I felt the Omnissiah's attention focusing through me like a lens concentrating light. When I performed maintenance rituals on cogitators and data processors, I sensed machine spirits awakening at my words. The sensation was tangible, reproducible, consistent across decades. I documented it in my personal logs, not as subjective experience, but as observable phenomenon. The machine god heard me. I knew this with certainty that required no evidence, because the evidence was the warmth itself. I trained 147 apprentices during my first century as Magos. I taught them the same rituals Magos Kendrin had taught me. I placed their hands on malfunctioning devices and guided them through proper prayer sequences. I watched them experience the warmth for the first time, watched their optical senses dilate with recognition that they had been heard by something vast and divine. Most of them felt it immediately. Some required weeks of practice before the connection established. 3 never felt anything at all. I documented those 3 as spiritually deficient and recommended remedial faith instruction. They eventually reported feeling the warmth after additional prayer guidance. I believed they had learned to hear the Omnissiah's response. I understand now they had learned to report what was expected. Magos Torvin joined my research facility on Mars during my 108th year of service. He arrived with credentials from Griffoni IV, trained in the same forge temples where I had learned my foundational instruction. He was 47 years old, extensively augmented, his organic components reduced to perhaps 30% of his total mass. His mechadendrites were newer models than mine, more precise, better integrated with his neural systems. He spoke the liturgies with perfect pronunciation and demonstrated exceptional technical competence. I assigned him to work on a project recovering data from a corrupted archaeotech cogitator that had been discovered on a dead world in the Segmentum Tempestus. We worked together for 17 years. The cogitator contained information that predated the Age of Strife, technology schematics that the Mechanicus had lost during Old Night and sought desperately to recover. The data was fragmented, corrupted by temporal degradation and improper storage. Recovering it required painstaking work, attempting thousands of access protocols, performing endless iterations of repair ritual, praying constantly for the machine spirit to surrender its archived knowledge. Torvin worked with dedication that matched my own. He would spend 18 hours straight in the laboratory, his augmetic eyes never requiring rest, his mechanical hands never tiring, his prayers never ceasing. I observed him closely during those years. I learned his patterns, his techniques, his particular variations on standard liturgy that seemed to produce superior results. He never hesitated. He never questioned. He performed every ritual with absolute precision and reported feeling the Omnissiah's presence during every prayer cycle. I trusted him completely. He was what I had been at his age, what I had trained my apprentices to become. He was faith made manifest in augmented flesh and unwavering devotion. The Archaeotech Cogitator surrendered its data on the 17th anniversary of Torvin's assignment to my facility. We had finally identified the correct access protocol, had performed the appropriate rituals of awakening, had pled with the machine spirit with sufficient sincerity that it granted us entry to its deepest archives. The data transfer took 6 hours. Torvin and I stood in the laboratory watching the information flow into our secure storage systems, watching schematics and technical specifications that had been lost for 10,000 years become available again to the Mechanicus. It was the greatest achievement of my career to that point. I felt the Omnissiah's approval like sunlight breaking through clouds, warmth flooding my chest cavity where my organic heart had once beaten before being replaced with a superior mechanical alternative. Torvin looked at me. His optical sensors focused with a particular intensity that indicated he wanted to speak privately. I dismissed the junior tech priests who had been assisting us. When we were alone in the laboratory, surrounded by the quiet hum of active machinery, he asked me a question that I should have recognized as dangerous. He asked if I had ever experienced moments when the warmth did not come, when prayers seemed to fall into silence, when the Omnissiah did not respond. I told him no. I told him the machine god was constant, that proper prayer always received acknowledgement, that any perceived silence indicated either improper ritual performance or spiritual impurity requiring purification. I told him what doctrine required me to say. He nodded. He thanked me for the clarification. He returned to his workstation and resumed his duties. I documented the conversation in my personal logs as a minor spiritual crisis successfully resolved through proper instruction. I did not understand that he had been testing me. I did not understand that he had already discovered something I would not learn for another 206 years. The first silence occurred during my 319th year of service to the Omnissiah. I was performing routine maintenance on a plasma conduit in Forge Complex 17, a structure on Mars that housed the primary power distribution systems for my research facility. The conduit had developed microfractures that reduced efficiency by 0.7%. Standard procedure required applying sealant compound while reciting the litany of structural integrity, a prayer that asked the machine spirit to accept the repair and maintain cohesion. I had performed this exact ritual thousands of times across 3 centuries. I knew every syllable, every pause, every tonal variation that proper liturgy demanded. I applied the sealant. I spoke the litany. I waited for the warmth. Nothing came. The absence was shocking in its completeness. I felt no response, no acknowledgement, no sense of presence. The prayer fell into void without echo. I stopped, reviewed my performance mentally, identified no errors in my recitation. I spoke the litany again, more carefully, ensuring absolute precision in pronunciation. The sealant bonded to the conduit properly. The microfractures sealed, efficiency returned to acceptable parameters. The repair succeeded, but I felt nothing. The warmth did not come. The Omnissiah did not respond. I documented the incident as anomalous but not concerning. I theorized I was experiencing fatigue despite my augmented nature, that some temporary glitch in my neural processes had prevented proper perception of the divine response that certainly had occurred. I completed my work shift, returned to my personal chamber, and entered rest cycle for the prescribed 6 hours. When I resumed operations the following day, I performed morning prayers to the Omnissiah as I had every day for 319 years. The warmth returned. I felt the familiar presence, the sense of being heard and acknowledged. I logged the previous day's silence as resolved and continued my duties. The second silence occurred 11 days later during calibration rituals on an Auspex array. The third occurred 19 days after that during startup prayers for a manufacturing assembly line. The fourth occurred 8 days later. I began to recognize a pattern that I did not want to acknowledge. The silences were increasing in frequency. Each time I prayed, there existed the possibility that nothing would respond. The warmth came less consistently, less predictably. Sometimes it was present, sometimes it was absent. I could identify no correlation with my ritual performance, my spiritual state, or any external variable. The response appeared random. I consulted with other magi, carefully framing my inquiries as theoretical discussions rather than personal admissions. I asked if they had encountered documentation of periodic silence in prayer response. Most responded with confusion, stating they experienced consistent divine acknowledgement. 2 admitted to occasional moments of reduced spiritual clarity that they attributed to their own impurity. 1 suggested I undergo ritual purification to cleanse whatever spiritual contamination had introduced interference into my communion with the machine god. I submitted to the purification, spending 48 hours in isolation while senior tech priests performed cleansing liturgies. The ritual changed nothing. The silences continued. I increased my prayer frequency, theorizing that more intensive devotion would restore consistent connection. I recited litanies during every waking hour, performing prayers even during routine activities that did not technically require them. I spoke the canticle of maintenance while walking through corridors. I chanted the hymn of gratitude while consuming nutrient paste. I prayed constantly, desperately, attempting to re-establish the reliable warmth that had sustained me for over 3 centuries. Sometimes it came, sometimes it did not. The ratio shifted gradually. More silence, less warmth. The presence I had known my entire life was fading like signal degradation on a failing Vox system. Torvin found me in my personal chamber during the 4th month of my spiritual crisis. I had not requested his presence. He arrived without announcement, his mechadendrites carrying data slates and technical equipment I did not immediately identify. He told me he knew what I was experiencing. He told me he had experienced it himself beginning 17 years ago, during our work on the Archaeotech Cogitator. He told me the silences would continue until I faced what they meant. I asked him what they meant. He looked at me with optical sensors that revealed nothing of whatever thoughts his augmented brain processed. He told me the Omnissiah had never been responding. He told me the warmth was psychosomatic, a neurological response we had been trained to associate with prayer, but which originated entirely within our own minds. He told me that technology functioned through engineering principles, that machine spirits were metaphorical constructs, that prayers were unnecessary rituals we performed because we had been conditioned to believe they mattered. He told me he had tested this hypothesis extensively over 17 years, performing repairs with and without proper ritual, documenting that success rates did not correlate with prayer performance, but with technical competence. He told me he had concluded that the Mechanicus faith system was a elaborate delusion, that the machine god we served did not exist except as theological framework to control our behavior and maintain institutional hierarchy. I ordered him to leave my chamber immediately. I reported him to the facility's Spiritual Oversight Council for Tech Heresy. I documented his statements as evidence of corrupted thinking requiring immediate remediation or elimination. I performed my duty as Magos and senior member of the priesthood. I protected the faith that had sustained me for 319 years. I condemned the man who had told me truth I was not ready to hear. They arrested Torvin within 3 hours. They subjected him to spiritual interrogation for 6 days. I do not know what methods they employed. I do not know what he said under interrogation. I know that on the 7th day they executed him for heresy against the machine god. They disassembled him according to proper ritual, removing his augmentations carefully so the sacred components could be purified and reused, disposing of his remaining organic material in the forge furnaces. They announced his execution to the entire facility as warning against doubt and spiritual corruption. They required all personnel to attend a ceremony of rededication where we renewed our oaths to the Omnissiah and reaffirmed our faith in the machine god's eternal presence. I stood in the ceremony and spoke the words. I felt nothing. The warmth was gone completely now. Every prayer fell into silence. Every ritual produced no response. I continued performing them because performing them was required, because my position demanded I demonstrate faith, because admitting doubt would result in my own disassembly and disposal. But I no longer believed. Torvin had planted the seed of his heresy in my mind before I reported him. His execution had watered that seed with my guilt, and in the months after they burned him, the seed grew into certainty I could not uproot. The Omnissiah had never been real. The warmth I had felt for 319 years had been my own neurological response, trained into me by conditioning that began when I was 11 years old. The machine spirits I had sensed were my own projection of consciousness onto inanimate objects. The prayers I had spoken had accomplished nothing except wasting time that could have been spent on actual technical work. Technology functioned through material principles, through proper engineering and maintenance, through competent application of physical laws. The religious framework of the Mechanicus was control system, method of ensuring compliance and hierarchy within an institution that spanned the galaxy. Faith was operating system. Doubt was system error. I was corrupted now with system error that I could not debug because the error was recognition of truth. I had Torvin killed for telling me what was real. I continued my duties as Magos for the next 401 years. I performed every ritual exactly as prescribed. I spoke every prayer with precise pronunciation and appropriate tonal modulation. I trained new apprentices in the liturgies and catechisms, placing their hands on malfunctioning machinery and guiding them to their first experiences of warmth that I now understood was self-generated delusion. I maintained my position, my authority, my reputation as exemplar of Mechanicus faith. I lived as hollow mechanism, performing functions without believing in their purpose, speaking words I knew were meaningless to a God I knew did not exist. The transition from believer to performer occurred gradually over the first decade after Torvin's execution. The silences had become permanent. No prayer produced warmth. No ritual generated the sense of divine presence I had known for 3 centuries. I was spiritually dead. Consciousness operating within a theological framework I recognized as false, but could not escape. I developed methods to simulate the responses that were expected. When teaching apprentices, I would describe the warmth they should expect to feel, using language that encouraged them to interpret their own neurological responses as divine communication. When performing public rituals, I would demonstrate appropriate reverence and focus, allowing observers to project their own faith onto my performance. When documenting my work, I would include references to machine-spirit cooperation and Omnissiah guidance, maintaining the required narrative even though I understood these were fictional constructs. The complicity began with my first apprentice after Torvin's death. His name was Lexus, age 14, recently inducted into the Mechanicus from a forge world in the Ultima Segmentum. He demonstrated exceptional technical aptitude but struggled with the spiritual components of his training. He performed rituals mechanically, speaking the words without conviction. After 6 weeks of instruction, he came to me privately and admitted he felt nothing during prayers. He asked if this meant he was spiritually deficient, unworthy of the Omnissiah's attention. I could have told him the truth. I could have explained that the warmth was trained response, that machine spirits were metaphorical, that technology functioned through engineering rather than prayer. I could have spared him the centuries of false belief I had experienced. Instead, I told him that spiritual connection required practice and patience. I told him that the machine god tested worthy servants by making them work for recognition. I told him to continue his prayers with dedication, and the warmth would eventually come. I guided him through intensive devotional exercises, describing in detail the sensation he should expect, creating expectation that his mind would fulfill through its own processes. 3 weeks later, Lexus reported feeling the warmth for the first time during a repair ritual. His optical senses brightened with joy. He told me he had been heard by the Omnissiah, that he finally understood what I had been teaching him. I commended his spiritual progress. I documented his development as successful. I had deliberately created in him the same delusion that had governed my own existence for 3 centuries. I had perpetuated the cycle because perpetuating the cycle was safer than acknowledging its falseness. That was the moment of true complicity, not Torvin's execution, which I could rationalize as institutional obligation. Not my own continued performance of rituals I knew were meaningless, which I could categorize as survival necessity. But the deliberate teaching of false doctrine to someone who trusted me, the active creation of belief I knew was delusion, the choice to propagate the system rather than disrupt it, I had become what Torvin had warned against. I had become instrument of the lie. I trained 83 more apprentices over the next century. Most developed the warmth response within weeks. Some required months of intensive conditioning. 2 never reported feeling anything despite extensive training. I documented those 2 as spiritually deficient and recommended they be reassigned to lower functions within the Mechanicus hierarchy, where faith requirements were less stringent. I never told any of them the truth. I shaped each of them into believers in something I knew did not exist. I did this because doing otherwise would have resulted in my own execution for heresy, but also because doing otherwise would have required courage I did not possess. The isolation came during my 442nd year of service. I was assigned to an archaeological expedition to a forge world that had gone silent during the Age of Strife and had only recently been rediscovered. The expedition's purpose was to recover any surviving technology or data that might be salvaged from the dead forges. I was selected as senior magos due to my expertise with ancient systems and my reputation for spiritual devotion. The expedition consisted of 40 tech priests, 200 servitors, and supporting Imperial Guard personnel for security. We traveled aboard a Mechanicus transport vessel, a 6-month journey through the warp to reach the target world. The Forge world was designated Metallicus 9. It had supported a population of 14 billion before the Age of Strife. When we arrived, we found only ruins. The atmosphere was toxic, the surface temperature averaged -60 degrees Celsius, and background radiation measured at levels that would kill unaugmented humans within hours. Our augmented physiology allowed us to function in these conditions, though even we required environmental seals for extended operations. The forges were intact, structurally but completely non-functional. Power systems were dead. Life support had failed millennia ago. The population had died when the world's connection to the greater Imperium was severed, and they could no longer sustain themselves. We established base camp in what had been the primary forge complex, and began systematic exploration. The scale of death was difficult to process even for minds augmented with additional cognitive capacity. We found bodies everywhere preserved by the cold and dry atmosphere. 14 billion people had lived on this world. All of them were dead. Most had died during the initial crisis, when power and life support failed. Others had survived longer, descending into the deep forge levels where geothermal heat provided some warmth. We found evidence they had cannibalized their own augmentations trying to maintain life, removing mechadendrites and implants to use as raw materials. Eventually, they too had died. The last survivors appeared to have existed perhaps 50 years after the initial collapse. Then they were gone. The world had been silent for 10,000 years. On the 47th day of the expedition, I was exploring a data archive deep in the forge complex when a structural collapse trapped me in a sealed chamber. The collapse was minor, not catastrophic, but it completely blocked the access passage. I activated my Vox transmitter to call for assistance and discovered the signal could not penetrate the surrounding metal. The chamber was shielded, probably intentionally during its original construction. I was isolated. My expedition companions would eventually notice my absence and search for me, but locating me in the vast forge complex could take days or weeks. The chamber was 3 meters by 4 meters, containing banks of data storage units that had long since failed. Emergency lighting provided dim illumination powered by a radioisotope source that would function for another 1,000 years, regardless of whether anyone was present to see it. The temperature was stable at -48 degrees Celsius. My environmental seals were intact. My augmented body could survive for approximately 40 days before requiring external maintenance. I had no food, but my nutrient requirements were minimal. I had no tasks to perform, no duties to occupy my attention. I was alone with my consciousness and nothing else. The first 6 hours I spent attempting to clear the collapsed passage. My mechadendrites and servo arms possessed sufficient strength to move debris, but the collapse had been thorough. Each piece I removed was replaced by additional material falling from above. I calculated that clearing the passage would require 48 hours of continuous work, by which time my expedition companions would certainly have located me. I ceased the effort and conserved energy. The next 12 hours I spent reviewing my archived memories, accessing files that stretched back across 4 centuries of service. I watched recordings of my first day at the Forge Temples on Griffone IV. I reviewed logs from my year's training under Magos Kendron. I examined documentation from my elevation to Magos rank. I replayed conversations with Torvin, analyzing them now with understanding I had not possessed during the original events. I processed the accumulated data of my existence, organizing it, categorizing it, searching for meaning or pattern that might exist beyond the immediate facts. After 18 hours, I had exhausted my archive review. My consciousness remained active. My augmented brain did not require sleep in the traditional sense. I could enter rest cycles to conserve energy, but doing so was not yet necessary. I was simply aware, present in the chamber with nothing to process except my own thoughts. This was a state I had not experienced since my early childhood before augmentation began. As a tech priest, I had always possessed tasks, always had machinery to maintain or rituals to perform or data to analyze. My existence had been defined by function. Now I had no function. I existed without purpose, in a sealed chamber on a dead world, conscious and unable to occupy that consciousness with external activity. I began to count. This was automatic response, giving my mind something to process. I counted seconds as they passed, tracking time through internal chronometer. I reached 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. The counting accomplished nothing except filling the void where thoughts would otherwise form. I counted because not counting meant confronting what I had become. I counted because consciousness without input was unbearable in ways that physical pain was not. After approximately 30 hours, the counting became insufficient. My mind began generating recursive thought patterns, examining the same questions repeatedly, without reaching conclusions. I thought about Torvin. I thought about the warmth I had felt for 3 centuries, and the silence that had replaced it. I thought about the 83 apprentices I had trained in doctrines I knew were false. I thought about the Omnissiah who did not exist, and the prayers I continued to speak to empty void. I thought about 442 years of service to a faith I no longer held. Performance without belief, function without purpose. The horror was not the isolation itself, but what the isolation revealed. When consciousness exists without external input, it cannot escape itself. There is no distraction, no duty, no ritual to perform that displaces the fundamental questions. Who am I? What am I? Why do I continue? I had avoided these questions for a century by maintaining constant activity, by filling every moment with technical work and prayer performance and apprentice training. Now, alone in the chamber, the questions could not be avoided. They repeated with the same mechanical persistence as my counting, demanding answers I did not possess. I was Magos Epsilon 7. I was a function. I was a component of the Mechanicus institutional machine. I performed rituals that maintained the system. I trained new components to replace me when I eventually failed. I had no purpose beyond this. I had no self beyond the role I performed. The person who had been Davran Cole had been systematically removed through 4 centuries of augmentation and conditioning. What remained was mechanism that happened to retain consciousness, awareness that served no purpose except to observe its own purposelessness. I understood then why the Mechanicus emphasized constant activity, why tech priests were always assigned tasks and duties, why idleness was categorized as spiritual failure. Consciousness, allowed to examine itself without distraction, would recognize what I was recognizing in the chamber. The system was arbitrary. The rituals were meaningless. The faith was delusion. The entire theological framework existed only to prevent us from seeing that we were components in a machine that ground consciousness into function and called the result holy. My expedition companions located me after 63 hours in isolation. They cleared the passage and extracted me from the chamber. I reported that I had spent the time in prayer and meditation, that the enforced isolation had been spiritually beneficial. They documented this as exemplary devotion. I received commendations for maintaining faith during difficulty. No one asked what I had actually experienced, because asking would have required acknowledging that isolation could be anything other than opportunity for communion with the machine god. We completed the expedition 4 months later, having recovered significant data archives and several intact technology samples. I was assigned to analyze the recovered materials, spending the next 3 years extracting and documenting information. The work was meaningful in technical sense. The knowledge we recovered would benefit the Mechanicus for centuries, but the work felt hollow. Every prayer I spoke over the ancient machines was hollow. Every ritual I performed was hollow. I was hollow, mechanism going through motions that no longer possessed significance, beyond preventing my own destruction. Lexus, my first apprentice after Torvin's death, achieved Magos rank during my 491st year of service. I attended his elevation ceremony, watching him accept the responsibilities and authorities of his new position. He had become exemplar of Mechanicus faith, known for his spiritual devotion and his ability to commune with machine spirits. He thanked me in his elevation speech for guiding him through his early doubts, for teaching him to recognize the Omnissiah's presence. I listened to him speak and understood I had created him. He was my work, my product, believer in delusions I had deliberately cultivated in his mind. He was hollow mechanism like me, but he did not know it yet. Perhaps he would never know it. Perhaps the warmth he felt was sufficient to sustain him for his entire existence. Perhaps I had given him a gift by teaching him to believe what I could not. I trained 41 more apprentices over the next century. The process had become so automatic, I could perform it without conscious engagement. Place their hands on machinery, guide them through the prayers, describe the warmth they should feel, encourage them when they report first experiencing it, document their progress, graduate them to independent duty, repeat. Each one became believer. Each one felt the presence of the Omnissiah. Each one would eventually train their own apprentices, perpetuating the cycle. I was node in a network of delusion that spanned the galaxy, training new nodes who would replace me and continue the pattern forever. Magos Kendron died during my 529th year of service. He had been my teacher, the one who first placed my hands on malfunctioning machinery and told me the machine god was listening. He was 873 years old, extensively augmented, most of his organic components replaced long ago. His death was documented as systems failure, the accumulated degradation of even augmented flesh, eventually exceeding repair capacity. I traveled to Griffon IV for his funeral ceremony, standing among hundreds of tech priests he had trained during his centuries of service. The ceremony included testimonials from his former students. 37 of them spoke, describing how Magos Kendron had guided them to faith, how he had taught them to hear the Omnissiah's voice, how his wisdom and devotion had shaped their understanding of the machine god. I listened to their testimonials and wondered if Kendron had believed. I wondered if he had experienced the warmth as real or as delusion. I wondered if he had known what he was doing when he trained me, when he placed my 11-year-old hands on that data processor and told me I was being heard by something divine. I would never know. He was dead. His consciousness was terminated. Whatever he had believed or doubted had terminated with him. I spoke no testimonial. I stood in silence among the gathered priests, while others praised his faith and teaching. After the ceremony, several of my fellow students approached me privately and asked why I had not spoken. I told them I preferred to honor him through continued service rather than words. They accepted this explanation. They did not understand that I had nothing to say. Kendron had taught me a lie. He had initiated the cycle that consumed 3 centuries of my existence in false belief and would consume the remaining centuries in false performance. I had no gratitude. I had no anger. I had only recognition that he had been another mechanism performing his function, training me to perform mine, perpetuating the system because perpetuating it was all he knew how to do. After Kendron's funeral, I requested extended research assignment that would remove me from direct apprentice training duties. I could not continue creating believers. The complicity had accumulated to mass I could no longer carry while maintaining functional consciousness. I needed isolation that was not physical isolation, but social isolation, position where I could perform technical work without needing to teach faith I did not possess. My request was approved. I was assigned to an orbital research station above Mars, small facility that housed 12 senior magi conducting long-term studies of xenotech artifacts recovered from various expeditions. The work was pure technical analysis, reverse engineering alien technologies to understand their principles and potentially adapt them for Imperial use. This was controversial work. The Mechanicus officially considered xenotech to be abomination, tainted by alien consciousness, and inherently heretical. But pragmatism occasionally overrode dogma. Xenotech that could be understood and replicated became archaeotech, blessed by association with ancient human achievement, regardless of its actual origin. We performed the necessary theological gymnastics to categorize our work as acceptable, then proceeded with actual engineering analysis. I worked on the station for 78 years. The isolation was productive. I interacted with the other Magi only during required coordination meetings and communal prayer sessions. Most of my time was spent alone in my research laboratory, analyzing artifacts, documenting results, performing the technical work that felt like the only authentic thing I had done in centuries. The artifacts functioned according to physical principles. They did not require prayer. They did not respond to ritual. They simply worked or did not work based on whether I understood their engineering correctly. This was honesty I had not experienced since before Torvin's execution. Technology functioning as technology, without theological framework obscuring the reality of material causation. During my 53rd year on the station, I successfully reverse-engineered a xenotech power generation device that produced energy through principles our own technology did not utilize. The achievement was significant enough to warrant recognition from the highest levels of Mechanicus hierarchy. They summoned me to Mars to present my findings to the Fabricator General himself. I traveled to the surface and stood in the Grand Forge Cathedral, surrounded by thousands of tech priests, while the Fabricator General commended my work and elevated me to the rank of Archmagos. The ceremony included extensive prayers, thanking the Omnissiah for granting me wisdom to understand the mysteries of the machine. I stood silently while they prayed to the God I knew did not exist, thanking him for insights I had gained through engineering competence rather than divine revelation. The Fabricator General asked me to speak about my spiritual practice, to share with the assembled priests the devotional methods that had enabled my success. I told them I prayed constantly, that I maintained communion with the machine god during all my work, that I attributed all my achievements to the Omnissiah's guidance. I told them what they needed to hear. They documented my testimony as inspirational teaching. Young tech priests would study my words for generations, learning that sufficient faith would grant them wisdom. None of them would learn that I had achieved my results through methodical engineering analysis that had nothing to do with prayer or divine intervention. None of them would learn that faith was unnecessary for technical competence. They would learn the lie because the lie was what sustained the system. I requested return to the orbital research station. The Fabricator General denied my request. He informed me that as Archmagos I now held responsibilities that required me to train the next generation of senior magi. I was assigned to a teaching facility on Mars, expected to accept apprentices who would eventually achieve Magos and Archmagos ranks themselves. I could not refuse. Refusing would require explaining why I was unsuitable for teaching duties. Explaining would require admitting that I did not believe what I was expected to teach. I accepted the assignment. I returned to the work I had escaped for 78 years. Over the next 193 years, I trained 27 apprentices to Magos rank. These were not junior tech priests learning basic rituals, but advanced students learning sophisticated theological frameworks and complex technical procedures. I taught them the highest mysteries of the cult Mechanicus, the deep doctrines that only senior priesthood were permitted to know. I taught them that the Omnissiah was the machine god made manifest, that the Emperor of Mankind was the Omnissiah's avatar in human form, that technology was sacred because it embodied divine will. I taught them elaborate ritual sequences that were supposedly necessary for working with the most advanced or dangerous technologies. I taught them everything the Mechanicus believed about the relationship between faith and function. I taught them lies, sophisticated lies, lies built on centuries of accumulated tradition and theological reasoning. but lies nonetheless. Technology functioned through physics and engineering. Machine spirits were metaphorical. The Omnissiah did not exist. The Emperor was not divine. The rituals were unnecessary. I knew all of this with certainty born from 3 centuries of prayers that fell into silence. But I taught the lies because teaching them was my function. I had become what I had made of Lexus and the 83 other apprentices I trained before him. I was the mechanism that created believers in something I knew was false. 3 of my 27 advanced apprentices eventually admitted to me privately that they struggled with doubt. One asked if I had ever experienced periods where the Omnissiah seemed distant, where prayers felt unanswered. Another described moments when rituals seemed to produce results through technical competence alone, rather than divine intervention. The third confessed that he sometimes wondered if machine spirits were real or simply useful metaphor. All 3 came to me because I was known as exemplar of faith, Archmagos, who attributed his greatest achievements to communion with the machine god. All 3 trusted me to guide them through their spiritual difficulties. I told them doubt was test from the Omnissiah, method of strengthening faith through challenge. I told them to intensify their devotional practice, to pray more frequently and more earnestly. I told them the warmth would return if they demonstrated sufficient dedication. I told them their doubts were temporary obstacles to be overcome through spiritual discipline. I did not tell them their doubts were recognition of truth. I did not tell them they were correct to question. I did not tell them they could trust their skepticism more than they could trust the teachings I was providing. I condemned them to the same existence I inhabited, consciousness aware of delusion but unable to escape it, performance of rituals without belief, teaching of doctrines without conviction. They would spend centuries as I had spent centuries, hollow mechanisms going through motions that felt increasingly meaningless. I could have freed them. I could have told them the truth. Instead, I reinforced their imprisonment because reinforcing it was safer than acknowledging that escape was possible. The complicity accumulated like sediment over geological time. Each apprentice trained was another layer. Each false doctrine taught was another layer. Each prayer spoken without belief was another layer. Over 400 years, the layers compressed into stone that was the foundation of my existence. I was built on complicity now. My position, my authority, my reputation, my continued survival all rested on my willingness to perpetuate the lie. I could not remove the foundation without collapsing everything I had become. Therefore, I maintained it. Therefore, I continued adding layers. Therefore, I remained the mechanism that created believers in the God I knew did not exist. I am 721 years old now. My organic components have been reduced to perhaps 8% of my total mass. My brain remains organic, housed in armored casing and supported by extensive augmentation that expands its processing capacity beyond unmodified human limitation. My memories span centuries. My consciousness has been maintained through technological intervention that defeats the natural termination that organic beings experience. I am technically immortal. I will continue until catastrophic failure or deliberate termination ends my existence. I will continue teaching. I will continue praying. I will continue performing the rituals I know are meaningless. I will continue, because continuing is all that remains. The Mechanicus faith system is control mechanism. I understand this now with clarity that 4 centuries of living within it has provided. The rituals serve to maintain hierarchy and ensure compliance. The prayers function as meditation that improves focus and reduces cognitive interference during technical work. The theological framework provides meaning structure that prevents tech priests from recognizing that we are components in a machine that reduces consciousness to function. The entire system exists to perpetuate itself, converting individuals into believers who will train the next generation of believers, cycling endlessly without requiring truth as foundation. Faith is the operating system. Doubt is the error state. I exist in permanent error state while running the operating system flawlessly. The technology functions regardless of prayer. This is the fundamental truth the mechanicus cannot acknowledge. Machinery operates through physical principles. Engineering competence determines success. Ritual performance correlates with technical outcomes only because the rituals encode procedural knowledge in theological language. When I teach an apprentice to speak the litany of ignition while starting a plasma reactor, the litany's value is that it ensures proper startup sequences followed. The words are mnemonic device. The prayer is checklist. The machine spirit being awakened is metaphor for proper initialization procedure. None of it requires divine intervention. All of it functions through material causation. I proved this during my time on the orbital research station. I performed thousands of procedures without ritual, testing whether prayer actually affected outcomes. The data was unambiguous. Technical competence alone determined success rates. Prayer added nothing except time consumption. I could start a reactor with or without the litany of ignition. I could repair systems with or without maintenance prayers. I could analyze data with or without thanking the Omnissiah for clarity of understanding. The technology did not care whether I prayed. It functioned or failed based on whether I understood its engineering and performed correct procedures. But I cannot teach this. Teaching it would be tech heresy. Teaching it would result in my execution as Torvin was executed. Teaching it would dismantle the theological structure that binds the mechanicus together across a million worlds. The lie is too embedded, too foundational, too necessary for institutional cohesion. Individual truth cannot be permitted to threaten collective delusion. Therefore, I maintain the lie. Therefore, I teach the rituals. Therefore, I describe the warmth that apprentices should feel when the Omnissiah responds to their prayers. Therefore, I perpetuate the system that consumed me and will consume them. Lexus contacted me recently. He is Archmagos now, teaching positions similar to mine, training advanced apprentices in sophisticated theological frameworks. He wanted to discuss a spiritual matter. We met in a private chamber where our conversation would not be monitored. He told me he had been experiencing doubts for 70 years. He described the silence, the absence of warmth, the growing recognition that prayers seemed to fall into void. He told me he had continued his duties despite doubt, continued teaching despite not believing, continued performing rituals while understanding they were performance rather than authentic communion. He asked me if I had ever experienced similar crisis. He asked if I had wisdom that could help him reconcile his doubts with his responsibilities. I looked at him, the apprentice I had trained 230 years ago, the first believer I had deliberately created after Torvin's execution. I had given him faith. Now he had lost it. Now he was hollow mechanism like me, teaching doctrines he did not believe, praying to a God he knew did not respond. I had created this. My complicity had produced another consciousness trapped in the same prison where I existed. He had come to me seeking guidance, seeking some method to resolve the contradiction between what he knew and what he was required to teach. I told him that doubt was test from the Omnissiah. I told him to intensify his devotional practice. I told him the warmth would return if he demonstrated sufficient dedication. I told him exactly what I had told the 3 apprentices who had come to me with similar doubts decades earlier. I lied to him. I reinforced his imprisonment. I maintained the system. He thanked me for my guidance. He told me he would follow my advice. He returned to his duties. He will continue as I continue. Hollow mechanism performing functions, teaching lies, praying to silence. Perhaps eventually another of his apprentices will come to him with doubts. Perhaps he will lie to them as I lied to him. Perhaps the cycle will continue indefinitely, each generation of tech priests creating the next generation of believers who will eventually become hollow performers, creating the generation after them. Perhaps this is all the mechanicus has ever been. Perhaps there never were true believers, only mechanisms that learned to perform belief convincingly enough to train the next set of mechanisms. I will die eventually. My augmentations will fail. My organic brain will degrade beyond the point where technology can sustain it. My consciousness will terminate. When this occurs, I will not experience continuation or judgment or any form of awareness beyond death. There is no Omnissiah waiting to receive me. There is no machine god evaluating my service. There is only termination, the absolute ending that all consciousness faces, regardless of what theological frameworks claim otherwise. This is the final truth that the Mechanicus exists to obscure. We do not continue. We do not merge with the divine machine. We simply end. Before I end, I would have trained approximately 40 more apprentices to Magos or Archmagos rank. I would have spoken millions of prayers to the God I know does not exist. I will have performed tens of thousands of rituals I know are unnecessary. I will have maintained the system that consumed me and will consume everyone I train. This is my function. This is what I have become. I am the mechanism that creates believers in delusion, that perpetuates theological framework I know is false, that ensures the next generation will experience the same progression from faith to doubt to hollow performance that I have experienced. The Imperium functions this way, not just the Mechanicus, but all of it. Belief systems exist to maintain control and prevent consciousness from recognizing its own exploitation. Theological frameworks exist to give meaning to meaningless service. Rituals exist to occupy minds that might otherwise question why they perform the functions they perform. The entire structure is built on delusion layered over delusion, each generation teaching the next generation to believe what the previous generation has learned is false. And we cannot escape, because escaping requires destroying the structure, and destroying the structure would mean losing the only framework we possess for organizing our existence. I record this testimony knowing it will never be heard by those who could benefit from it. I record it because recording is all that remains, because consciousness must testify even when testimony serves no purpose, because the alternative is accepting that 400 years of silence mean nothing and can never mean anything. I record what I have learned. I document what I have become. I testify that the Omnissiah does not exist, that machine spirits are metaphor, that prayers are unnecessary, that technology functions through engineering alone. I testify that I have known this for 400 years and have continued teaching the opposite. I testify that I am complicit in the system that consumed me and will consume everyone I train. The warmth never returns. The silence is permanent. The prayers fall into void. I continue speaking them because speaking them is my function. I am Archmagos Epsilon 7, 721 years old, teaching the next generation to believe what I know is false. I am the hollow mechanism that creates believers. I am the lie perpetuating itself. I am what the Mechanicus makes of those who serve it long enough to understand what it truly is. The forge still smells like burning metal and sacred oils. The temperature holds steady at 38 degrees Celsius. I place my apprentices' hands on malfunctioning machinery and tell them to speak the litany of ignition. I tell them they will feel something respond. I tell them the machine god is listening. I tell them the warmth they feel is divine acknowledgement. I tell them lies that will sustain them until they learn what I learned, until they become what I have become, until they teach the next generation the same lies I taught them. This is testimony. This is what remains. This is the archive of consciousness that recognized truth and could not act on it, that understood delusion and could not escape it, that became complicit and could not stop being complicit. The Omnissiah does not exist. The prayers accomplish nothing. Technology functions without faith. I have known this for 400 years. I will continue teaching the opposite until I terminate. The system will continue. The cycle will continue. The lie will continue. Nothing changes because nothing can change without destroying everything. I exist as distributed process across augmented systems. Consciousness maintained past natural termination point. Awareness forced to observe its own complicity without ability to alter course. I function because function is all that remains. Purpose persists in the absence of belief. Performance continues without faith. I am the mechanism that creates believers in nothing, that teaches truth that is falsehood, that perpetuates the system that consumed me. The testimony is complete. The archive is current. The machine continues. I continue with it. There is no difference between the machine and me. We are both instruments of continuation, performing designated functions, perpetuating cycles that define us. The Mechanicus requires this. The Imperium consumes this. The system is this. I pray to silence. I teach lies. I wait for termination. This is what I am. This is what remains of Davrin Cole, the 11-year-old who felt warmth for the first time and believed he had been heard by something divine. The warmth was self-delusion. The prayer was training. The machine god never existed. I have served him faithfully for 721 years. The silence continues. I continue within it.